If you were not in class when we went over that example, that oligopoly example, you'll definitely want to go look for the video on that. It's from chapter 10. I think it was the second half of chapter 10. So you'll definitely want to watch that. It's pretty heavily weighted on your exam. So understanding how to analyze payoff matrix and identify those things that we talked about, whether it was a dominant strategy or a Nash equilibrium or any of that kind of stuff, that's going to be pretty important. Also, the other thing is going back to the monopoly chapter, making sure you understand the gain and loss of revenue for a monopolist when they decide to produce and sell an additional unit of a good. That would be a good thing to go back and look at. So today we are going to watch a quick video, which you're definitely going to want to pay attention to, not just because it's interesting and valuable, just from a overall life perspective, but also because you may get a pretty general question on your exam regarding this video. So please make sure that you're paying attention. So we'll finish up chapter 12 today. What we're going to do first is I'm going to show you a YouTube video. It's only about 6 minutes, but I think it shows you a much different perspective on labor resources than perhaps you've ever seen before, but it's going to be about sweatshops. And just to give you a little bit of background, sweatshops is kind of a slang term that those in developed countries use when talking about manufacturing facilities in developing countries that perhaps use child labor, perhaps don't have the best overall working conditions, obviously are not going to pay anywhere near the wage that we would get here in the US. But this, in talking and having a chapter about labor resource, especially after we talked in the last chapter about temporary price differentials and permanent price differentials, I think this is a pretty interesting segue from the first half of chapter 12 to the second half of chapter 12, because it really does talk about labor resources in other parts of the world and how perhaps you and I are not thinking clearly about the use of these sweatshops and just about really the economics of sweatshops. And I think that the video that I'm going to show you, if nothing else, gives you a new perspective. I never expect you, I try to be very clear about what is my opinion in this class and what is not. And I really just try and stay focused on the economics of issues. My point is not to make you believe what I believe or believe that economics is the end all be all to explain everything. It's more just to create some food for thought, maybe generate a little conversation about labor resources in other parts of the world. The price differential between US labor and labor in other developing countries is kind of permanent. Not to say that there won't come a day when the price of labor here in the US and the price of labor in developing countries might grow a little bit closer together, but that's going to be a long, long time from now. It definitely won't be in my lifetime. And so just thinking about the price differentials based on simply the geographic location of that resource, of that labor, I think is beneficial. And then what you'll see is towards the end of this video, we'll start to talk about labor unions and how labor unions have sort of gotten in on this whole like sweatshop thing. And because the second half of this chapter, chapter 12, is on labor unions, the video is really a beautiful segue. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so, here's what I was gonna say. In this video, I don't want you to think that I agree with everything everybody says in the video just because I'm showing it to you. But what I do want you to do is I want you to see some different perspectives, and then I think we need to come back and talk about it. So just because I show you a video doesn't mean that I believe everything that is said in the video or everything that the narrator believes or holds to be true. I just think it's an interesting perspective that I want you to have.
How do you feel about sweatshops? There are a lot of young Americans who want to rid the world of them. They're demanding that rules be passed to improve workers' lives. So who can say, give me a break to that? John, of course.
Of course. And I do, Barbara, because rules that in theory will make work better, in reality can make work disappear. Last month, there were big protests in Cancun, Mexico during the meeting of the World Trade Organization. They always protest, wherever this meeting is held. And the protests are being supported by increasing numbers of American students who say workers are being mistreated. Sweatshops are what they object to most. Factories like this one in Bangladesh, where adolescent girls make sweaters and are paid a fraction of American wages. The protesters seem to be winning the battle of public opinion. In 1996, they made Kathy Lee Gifford cry by saying she was exploiting these young workers in Honduras who made her clothing line.
I'm supposed to be personally responsible for everything that happens around the world, in Honduras.
Yes, say protesters like these. Within weeks, Kathy Lee was admitting the error of her ways. She joined President Clinton at the White House as she renounced the mistakes of her past.
That was one blouse and one pant too many.
Union shop, not sweatshop! Union shop, not
The student groups who protest get some funding from labor unions. The Steelworkers Union lets one group use part of their offices in Washington, D.C. Maybe that's why the protesting students are also upset about wages in America. This group once took over the office of Harvard's president and held it for 3 weeks, demanding higher wages for workers at the school. Their supporters camped outside, and even big-time actors, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, showed up to give their support. Senator Ted Kennedy came out and shook the students' hands. One of the leaders of this protest was Ben McKean. He assembled this group of student leaders to tell us what they're upset about.
The workers themselves have come to us and said, you benefit from our exploitation, give us back something.
And if we can tell the corporations that we don't want to buy products that are being made by people that they're able to exploit, then we can really help to end some of the serious problems affecting these people's lives.
Oh, that sounds very nice, except when we talk to some people who live in the places where the workers are supposedly being exploited in sweatshops, we heard a different story.
I wish these people would begin to think with their brains rather than with their hearts.
Vivek Debroy is an economist who lives in India. We interviewed him and these other supporters of globalization as they were on their way to Cancun.
I don't understand the expression sweatshops. There's nothing wrong with sweat. Sweat is good. Sweat is what most people in the developing world, including India, do all the time.
People get jobs in these places. Their generation lives better than their parents lived.
Chunarunga studies trade policy. She lives in Kenya.
Doesn't the United States have the responsibility to stop these companies from exploiting people in your country?
Exploiting people? Nobody in my country thinks about companies exploiting them. When there's a new company opening a factory, people are excited about it.
Arunga and Debroy point out that in poor countries, the Nike factories that well-fed American students call sweatshops routinely pay twice what local factories pay, and more than triple what people earn doing much harder and more dangerous work in the fields.
I wish we would have more sweatshops, quote unquote, in my country.
Most economists say what many Americans call sweatshops are what allowed people in now thriving places like South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong to pull themselves out of poverty. People started in the sweatshops, but then they moved on to better jobs.
Most of them work for these companies for a while, go off and start their own businesses. It's a win-win situation for everyone.
And that, she says, is why the students who protest are ignorant and clueless.
We don't want our clothes made in sweatshops. They have no idea what they're talking about.
sweatshops right away!
They're comparing that to what they have in their rich homes.
They called people like you ignorant and clueless. Rich, ignorant, and clueless.
The image that we have as being rich and clueless and just idealist college students is a false one. Do I have a vision of how I want the world to be? Sure, of course I do. I want the world to be one where people don't have to struggle to feed their children.
The workers are forced to migrate into the city or into places where factories like these exist.
Who's forcing them? They travel to the factory. They choose to work there.
Well, I mean, you would prefer eating to not eating.
Sure, but if you insist on higher wages, some of these factories will close. You're going to put people out of work.
We're not trying to close down sweatshops. We're trying to change sweatshops.
I mean, you say you're not, but that's the result of your protest. Some places will close. They'll go where the wages are lower.
The goal is to raise the wages across the board.
The protesters say that they don't want to take away the jobs. They just want to make them better.
By passing laws trying to improve the jobs by force, they will get rid of the jobs.
After the protests against Kathy Lee's clothing line, Walmart withdrew its Kathy Lee contract from a New York factory, taking work away from these workers. American complaints about child labor persuaded factories in Bangladesh to stop hiring adolescents. The result, according to UNICEF, is that many of the young girls turned to prostitution instead. These protests help poor people? Give me a break.
Okay, any thoughts? New perspective?
I liked how the one lady from Kenya, how she talked about, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of them go on further into like doing something else, which I never really thought of. Like, because when you think of a sweatshop, you think of underage kids working there being like treated like animals, like, you know, like you only earn like 10 cents an item you sew or whatever. But I liked how she was just talking about how, you know, a lot of them go up and start their own businesses, which I never really thought of because you just would think they'd be there forever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they get really valuable on-the-job training that they would never have had the opportunity to get had an organized factory not come in and sort of shown them how all of that sort of business end stuff is done. So yeah, I mean, I was surprised by that too, to be honest, when I watched this. It was one of the surprising things. Anybody else? Yeah, I think this video does give us perspective we hadn't thought about before. Listen, I think all of us are pretty uncomfortable with the idea of small children working 14 hours a day in disgusting, toxic factories. I think we're all uncomfortable, and we should be uncomfortable with that. Right? That these sweatshops, while they might not pay very much, a lot of times they're paying more than the equilibrium wage in that area. And so for those people, they are able to increase their standard of living, even though it's not to our standard. You know, for a lot of those people, that is the best option. We're not talking about slave labor here, which is a totally different animal, right? And it still happens in many parts of the world. We're talking about people who make a choice, even if they're very young, younger than we're comfortable with, to work at these production facilities. Our US history includes this same type of stuff. It was just a while ago for us. And so we don't really think about it, and we've forgotten about it, right? But there was a time during the Industrial Revolution, probably as recent as 100 years ago, that we had children working in really terrible, adults working in terrible conditions in this country. But it's why you and I get to live this way today, is because we went through that. It's just simple economics that says that people want to survive, and they're going to do what they need to survive. And because of the geographic location of their labor resource, they're just in a different situation. They just don't have a lot of choices. It's not that all those college students didn't have their heart in the right place. They did. But economics isn't really a heart-driven discipline. And do you think those college students know that shutting down sweatshops turns a 10-year-old into a prostitute? I don't think that we stop and think about the economics of some of this social stuff sometimes, and we impose our social sort of labor norms on a totally different geographic location. You know, Ben Affleck needs to stick to what he's good at doing and let economics really, you know, take its course. There's nothing you and I can do to stop that, right? These are developing countries. These are countries that now find themselves in a position to bring up entire populations of people to a different standard of living, but it's got to be ugly at first, right? Any other comments? Okay, so what you also saw in this video was you saw that unions got involved in some of these discussions. Now, for those of you who don't understand what unions are, it's really organized labor. The US has historically had organized labor, and it started out from a very, very good place. There was a time when we were trying to transition our society from these quote unquote sweatshops to sort of a more civilized production environment where we valued our labor resource, and when somebody lost an arm, we didn't just fire them, or there were certain safety regulations, there were certain standards by which we were going to conduct ourselves when it came to the usage of labor. Labor began to organize. This hasn't happened in a lot of other countries because they haven't reached the point yet where labor can begin to demand bigger and better. But unions are really organization of labor to improve working conditions, whatever that means. That could be wages, that could be benefit, that could be safety, that could be a lot of different things. But you could see that unions were supporting this anti-sweatshop activity because unions have lost their jobs, have lost employment here in this country to these sort of overseas manufacturing facilities because the labor is so incredibly inexpensive. And the organized labor here in the US has really driven up the price of labor here. We know labor is expensive in the US. It just is, right? All right, so let's move to our PowerPoint real quick, and so we can finish up chapter 12. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Okay, so if I was going to reorganize the slide, I would put labor unions as sort of the umbrella, and craft and industrial unions, I probably would have indented them or something, because they are types of labor unions. Labor unions organized to improve terms of employment. It is basically an organization that recruits laborers to join the organization and band together in order to improve terms of employment. Every once in a while, I get a postcard in my mailbox at NAU or something saying that a union wants to come into NAU. And they want to unionize teachers and staff, and because they want to improve our working conditions. It is an attempt, unions attempt to drive wages above market equilibrium in the same way that minimum wage is effective. Unions are catch-22, And as we talk through these slides, you're going to see they have a purpose, and especially 75, 80, maybe 100 years ago. I don't know exactly how long unions go back, but they served a real purpose in this country to really improve the working conditions of labor in this country. Present day, their purpose is not the same. They have been very effective at getting us a lot of great laws and a lot of great benefits and creating a situation where labor is comfortable in this country. So they may have outlived their usefulness, but we'll talk about the economics and you can decide for yourself, okay? So labor unions organized to improve terms of employment. The two basic type of unions that we're gonna talk about are craft unions and industrial unions. Craft unions are unions that organize a certain skill set of labor. So carpenters many times have a union, steel workers many times have a union. Someone with a certain skill set, no matter where they work, can be unionized or represented by a union. The second is going to be industrial unions. Industrial unions unionize an entire industry of workers, anywhere from your the auto workers have a union that is an industrial union. And this union would cover everyone in the industry from the really high level, like metal worker, somebody like that, all the way to perhaps janitorial staff. So it would cover all classes of workers within that industry and try and get everyone at any level of wage in that company to a higher than market equilibrium wage for labor. If you kind of can equate that to minimum wage, I think you can see already that there are problems with this theory and that it's going to create its own set of issues, right? One of the most important things, one of the most important activities, one of the most important responsibilities of unions is the process of collective bargaining. Process of collective bargaining is the process in which the union, this organized, and it actually, there are people that work for the unions to help organize all of the laborers that work in some different industry or have some different skill set, okay? But representatives from the union themselves negotiate with the management of these companies and try and come to some mutually agreeable contract. This is a long, drawn out, painful process. I worked in human resources at a company that had union labor, and this is excruciating. This can take likely months, in some case over a year, in order to negotiate these union contracts. These contracts can be good for a couple of years, they can be good for 5 years, and so they're it's a pretty important process, and these contracts are pretty important agreements because they do dictate the wages, the benefits, anything from the number of vacation days you get to the number of sick days you get to what's the procedure if you get laid off from your job. They detail really all working conditions, raises, things like that, any changes in benefits that are expected to happen during that period of time. These two parties, these two sides get together and just sort of hash out a little give and take, right, to get to some mutually agreeable contract. Now, this is easier said than done, right? It's a very difficult, very painful process. And so what you see in these last 3 bullet points are really progressive steps in finding resolution with collective bargaining. The first one is going to be something called mediation. Mediation is essentially counseling for the two different parties. So having some neutral party come in and help the two sides. If the two sides sort of get to a stalemate, nothing's really happening, they're not agreeing on certain issues, someone can come in, a mediator can come in and help resolve those issues or talk through those issues with the two different parties. So hopefully they can come to that mutually agreeable contract. A lot of times that doesn't work, right? And so the next step would be something called arbitration. This is usually done by a labor attorney, someone of that sort that charges by the day, that would come in, again, likely a neutral party, hopefully a neutral party, would come in, and beforehand, both of the parties would agree that whatever that arbitrator decides in terms of what they feel like is a fair contract, so sort of middle ground for the two different parties, that they will accept it. And so this labor attorney usually, typically comes in, listens to both sides, see how far both sides have gotten in terms of give and take, and then sort of splits the difference or makes some sort of a resolution to get the contract ratified, to get it accepted by both parties. If that doesn't work, if the two sides just cannot come to a mutually agreeable contract, is when we usually see strikes happen. Now, the strikes that you and I see present day look a lot different than strikes did, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? The strikes that we see today, teachers strike, pilots strike, people like that, right? Groups of people, and with similar skill sets. It usually has to do with them carrying signs and walking in a circle, chanting in front of some significant location, right? Where they feel like the right people are going to hear them. They stop working, right? And spend their days instead picketing, if you will. Strikes didn't always look like this. And actually, right out of college, I worked for a coal mining company, and the strikes at that company were intense. Wasn't a bunch of people walking around with signs, right? There are usually cops and firearms involved. So strikes just don't look like what they used to. But that is a last resort. We can't get any further in negotiation, and so we're just going to stop working and see how that goes. The one danger in that is that you can be replaced. Yeah, it's not really easy to replace a pilot, right? But you have to be careful that you're not opening yourself up into job loss when you do something like strike. All right, so let's break down, let's look at a couple of little graphs, right? Let's talk about one of these types of labor unions at a time. We're going to start with the industrial unions, which we also call inclusive, and then we're going to talk about the craft unions next. Basically, with an industrial union, my example was the auto workers union that is negotiating wages for everyone in that company. What they do is they negotiate a wage that is higher than the market wage. They basically impose a wage floor on all of the labor employed by that industry. That is their tactic, right? This wage floor in getting higher wages for the employees. The problem with getting higher wages for these employees is the demand for that labor is going to decrease as the price goes up. It's just like minimum wage, right? Minimum wage does the same thing. If you artificially inflate a price above equilibrium, yeah, that's great for the people that get it. It's great for those who still get hired or still have jobs when they increase minimum wage, or in this case, negotiate a higher than equilibrium wage for this labor. It's good for you. It's bad for everybody else, right? They're probably going to lay some people off because demand for labor is lower at that price. So people are going to get laid off, which is going to increase the supply of people looking for jobs outside of that union protection. And when you increase the supply of anything, you decrease its price. And so what industrial unions have the impact of doing is getting a higher than equilibrium rate for a very small group of people and getting a lower rate for everyone else, a lower wage in this case, because we're talking about labor for everyone else. And so it really throws the market off, okay? Some people, and I don't like to get political in this class, but there are people that believe strongly in unionization, and that's their right. But from an economic, but there are people that feel strongly about increasing minimum wage too. It doesn't mean it has sound economics, right? Anytime you throw a market off equilibrium, you should expect there to be some consequence. Any market, right? And so let's kind of look at this graph right here. You can see this first one is actually the industry as a whole, some industry that uses some type of labor. You can see that we had, or that we have actually an equilibrium in this market where supply meets demand at a wage of W and number of laborers or employees per period of E. But that when a union comes in and negotiates a higher than equilibrium wage at W prime, that you see there on that first graph, you can see that we end up with a surplus of labor. Same thing we end up with minimum wage. Demand is lower than supply because the price is so high, right? You and I want to supply a lot of labor at a high price, but our demanders, the firms that demand that resource, yeah, they don't demand that much. And so we end up with a surplus of labor. And so we end up with a surplus of labor in the union, and they have to go, right? Those employees, they're just not going to get hired. And so when we think about it on the firm level, a firm who could or would have accepted much more in terms of labor at that lower price W, but are now imposed a price of W prime, right? When we look at that second graph, you can see that we just simply, the numbers don't work out for us with that higher wage rate. And this is what we talked about in the last chapter, this marginal revenue product. Our marginal revenue product, that downward sloping, essentially our demand curve for resource, in this case, the labor resource, that has to do with what that resource is earning for us versus how much we have to pay for it, right? How much we have to pay for it is that marginal resource price. That's going to be those horizontal lines that say S, right? That's the supply of labor. That's what we have to pay for the labor, each unit. And so you can see that the intersection happens at a totally different place with that higher price. Much lower employment because of increased wage, okay? We're gonna see that in Flagstaff in a really big way because of the way that minimum wage has been forced to increase so dramatically so fast, right? Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about craft unions. Craft unions are going to be the type of union that is going to include people of a certain skill set. And so, like carpenters, steel workers, right? Those are going to be your craft union people. Craft unions go about increasing wages a totally different way. Because they don't have so much control over entire industries, they have to take a different approach. And the approach that craft unions use is to actually reduce the supply of labor to those particular crafts. So if we're talking about carpenters specifically, trying to keep the number of licensed, qualified carpenters to a bare minimum. Because if you can do that, if you can decrease the labor supply of carpenters, that will increase their equilibrium price. So it's more about changing the equilibrium than about creating a price floor above equilibrium. It's a more natural way to do it, actually. And so they reduce the labor supply using a host of different tactics. This can be really high initiation fees, so charging very high fees to get inside of these craft unions, to become a member of these craft unions. Long apprenticeship periods, this is basically internships, forcing new potential licensed carpenters to spend a lot of time working under a licensed carpenter, building their skill set, et cetera. It keeps them out of the labor force. Tough exam qualifications, restrictive licensing requirements, just trying to really work the system to make it more and more and more difficult to become a qualified licensed carpenter. You keep the supply low, you keep the price high, you keep the equilibrium price high. If you can force employers in industry to hire only union carpenters, you can achieve this. It's kind of hard to do though, right? It's kind of hard to do. We still end up with the same effect that we did with the industrial unions, in that workers inside of the union get a higher wage, and that higher wage leads to lower employment. We just can't afford them, right? So this first graph is going to show you, go ahead, is there a question? Sorry, I thought I heard somebody start to talk. Okay, so this first graph is actually going to be the representation of that decrease in labor supply. So you can see as the supply curve shifts to the left and decreases to the left, we end up with a totally new equilibrium, an equilibrium at a higher price and a lower quantity of labor employed. The other way that craft unions can get a higher wage, this is much more difficult, is to increase the demand for their labor. You increase demand for union labor because resource demand is derived. You would increase demand for union labor by increasing the demand for the goods that union labor produces. Those are American-made goods. So a lot of times when you see Buy American or Made in the USA campaigns, a lot of times it's going to be sponsored by unions because they are trying this tactic, right? They are trying to increase your demand for American-made goods. Does it work? It must work, right? You have to be willing to pay more for those goods, right? I mean, that's just simple economics. American-made goods are typically more expensive, right? Because of the labor cost involved. Are they better quality? Well, I don't know, right? We'd have to discuss a very particular good. Sometimes not, right? You have a much harder time convincing people to buy goods made in the USA than you do taking that first route, which is decreasing the labor supply. But a lot of times unions sort of work both angles in order to try and increase those wages. It's always been hard to convince Americans to buy made in the USA for whatever reason, right? It decreases our standard of living. If we bought all American-made goods, if we did not participate in the global market, you and I would have less of everything and we pay a lot more for it. And to you and I, that just doesn't seem like a good deal. Now, I think there are some people that definitely do adhere to this Made in the USA mindset whenever possible. I was helping my sister with a garage sale several years ago, and a guy showed up at this garage sale, right, flipping over tags and t-shirts to see if they were made in the USA because those were the only ones he was willing to buy. They were all the same price, right? They were $1 or whatever. That's a commitment. That's a walk the walk when it comes to Made in the USA, but that is not very common. So let's talk a little bit about trends in union membership. Union membership is trending downward. I wrote some stats. Back in 1950, 30% of all laborers were in a union. It's a pretty high percentage. And today it's less than 10%. I think it's hovering about 9% from the data that I can find. So that's a significant decrease. And there's several reasons as to why we have seen that happen, okay? Unions had their place. They had their time. They were in a very important and very integral part of the evolution of the labor workforce and the treatment of the labor workforce here in the US. Their membership is declining because perhaps, right, they have outlived their usefulness, okay? They really don't play the same role. So let's talk about why we have seen these declining rates in membership. The first one is something we call right to work states. States have been given the right to determine how much power unions can have in their state. In Arizona, we're a right to work state. And a right to work state is a state in which if you go to work for an industry that is unionized and people are paying their dues, if you're part of a union, you got to pay your dues, monthly dues usually. If you go to work for a company that has been unionized, you don't actually have to join the union. And you don't have to pay dues, but the union still has to protect you. So it's taken a lot of the power away from the unions and given it back to the state, if you will, the market. Structural changes in the US economy. Another thing unions have done is they have priced American labor out of the market. So we have seen a lot of our manufacturing jobs leave the US and go to other countries. And it is because of labor rates. Because unions inflate labor rates, it has been those unionized industries that have seen their industry fade fastest because companies have even more of an incentive to send their manufacturing overseas to get away from those even more inflated labor rates than just the regular market. Growth in market competition. Unionized firms cannot pass on higher labor costs as higher prices. There's just too much competition in the market, global competition in the market. And so if we weren't trading on a global scale, it might be possible for unions to charge higher prices for inflate prices for labor, and then for those costs to get passed on to the consumer. But in a highly competitive global market like we have now, it's just not possible. Firms will go out of business, right? If firms don't outsource labor to cheaper labor markets, they just simply won't make it because of the highly competitive nature of markets today, the global market today. And the last is the near disappearance of the strike. Like I said, strikes look totally different now than they used to, thankfully, really, but they just don't have the power that they used to have. We do have a fairly educated, well-trained labor force, and if someone walks away from their job, we can likely find replacements. And so they just really don't have the impact that they used to, and therefore we don't really see them as a negotiating tactic much anymore at all. Okay, that's